Today is Saturday, August 10th. It's official, the U.S. has welcomed a new pair of giant pandas for the first time in more than 2 decades. The animals made their debut at the San Diego Zoo just this week. And more pandas are expected to arrive at zoos in San Francisco and Washington, D.C. later this year. Of course, the pandas are incredibly cute, but they represent so much more. Later in this episode, we're talking about so-called panda diplomacy, explaining what the animals symbolize about the relationship between the world's 2 largest economies, the U.S. and China. But first, we're zooming out and talking more broadly about American zoos. Zoos are especially popular in the summer, especially with families, but they're not without their critics. So are they ultimately good or bad for animals? And is it ethical to visit zoos? Our first guest is wildlife biologist and host of the Fancy Scientist podcast, Dr. Stephanie Manka. She teaches people about wildlife, conservation, and science with the goal of helping people connect with nature. We'll get into both the pros and cons of zoos, what to watch for if you visit one, and her take on the arrival of the newest giant pandas. Welcome to the Newsworthy Special Edition Saturday, when we sit down with a different expert or celebrity every Saturday to talk about something in the news. Don't forget to tune in every Monday through Friday for our regular episodes, where we provide all the day's news in 10 minutes. I'm Erica Mandy. It's now time for today's Special Edition Saturday. Stephanie Manka, thank you so much for joining us here on the Newsworthy.
Thank you so much for having me.
So first, what do you think about zoos in general?
Well, zoos is a very broad term. So when zoos first originated, they were purely for entertainment. And there was no concern, no effort put towards animal care. And zoos have come a long way since then. So my opinion of zoos is if they do care about animals, if they have high animal welfare standards, research, conservation efforts, then they're a great way to see animals up close. But if not, if they're on the other end of the spectrum, then I think they're much better to skip.
And I want to go through some of the pros and cons of zoos. But let's start with some of the pros of zoos in today's world. And maybe we're talking about the zoos that you would approve of. How can zoos be a good thing?
I think the best thing about zoos is they really provide an opportunity for people to see animals up close. And when people get to see an animal, when they get to experience nature, then this gives them the capacity to care for it. There's a phrase that we won't protect what we don't care about. So zoos really provide us this option. And yes, we can see them on TV and on the internet now, but there's really something about seeing an animal in real life, and it allows for that emotional connection. And there's research to show that seeing nature and having emotional connections with nature, especially for children, this promotes pro-environmental and conservation behaviors. They are also really important for research, especially for captive breeding for populations that are severely endangered. Some species would be extinct, honestly, if it wasn't for zoos.
What about some of the cons of zoos? Why are there critics of zoos?
Some people think that zoos, no matter how amazing they are, no matter how much they care for the animals and how much room they provide for the animals, they just can't mimic the conditions that animals would have in the wild. And therefore, the animal would suffer in some way. The animal wouldn't be as satisfied as it would be in the wild. And that the conservation and education efforts of zoos don't outweigh their individual animal welfare.
And how do animals even end up in a zoo?
Originally, animals were taken from the wild. This doesn't really happen anymore unless it's a population of animals that is really close to being extinct. And this is a decision that scientists don't make lightly, to take either all or most of the individuals out of the wild to reproduce them. So now zoos have captive breeding programs. So the breeding programs for species reintroductions, but they also have breeding programs for zoo animals so that we can always ensure that there are a diversity of animals there.
In general, in addition to the captivity that animals are in, is it stressful for them to have humans coming by and looking at them all the time?
So the animals that are living in zoos now are, like I said, typically not from the wild. They're born in captivity. So they're probably used to people looking at them. And zoos have done or the more ethical zoos that we're talking about, they've done a really good job at understanding what stresses animals out. Because when zoos were more basic, like just bars and cages, and there still are a lot of zoos like that today, animals will have what's called stereotypic behavior, where they will do a lot of pacing, or in elephants, they'll do head bobbing, something that's done repetitive over and over again, which is a sign of stress. So zoos have really done a good job at providing the animals with some distance and people with some distance so that there isn't as much interference.
Would you say that the zoos in major cities that we've all heard of, are they typically more on the more ethical side, in your opinion?
So I would say that most of the zoos in the big cities here in the US, yes, they do have AZA accreditation. And that's an organization made up of scientists, veterinarians, and other wildlife and zoo professionals, and they set the standards.
So how can people know whether their local zoo or a zoo that they want to visit is operating ethically or not?
Good zoos really want to try to mimic what's going on in the wild. So you want to look at their enclosure. Do the animals have things to interact with and play with? This is called enrichment. Also, like social groupings as well. If it's a social species like a chimpanzee, is it alone or is it with other chimpanzees? And then also that distance between people and the animals. Even AZA zoos sometimes have experiences where you can touch animals. Like there might be a zookeeper holding a snake that you can touch. And that's okay, but you really shouldn't be like getting in enclosures with animals, and especially mammals. Like if there's lions and tigers and you're able to touch them, even if they're babies, that's a sign that the zoo doesn't have animal welfare prioritized, and it's more about profit. If they always have babies, if they're always advertising babies, that's another sign that it's a profit first zoo. Because what happens when those babies grow up? There's, no zoo can handle endless amounts of tigers growing up to become full grown adults.
So even if we're just going to our local zoo, if we see a problem, if we're concerned about the animals, what can someone do?
So yeah, if you really feel like you see some stereotypic behavior, like some animals that are doing some repeated movements, or they don't seem happy in some sense, then what I would suggest you do is reach out to an organization, like maybe a sanctuary that rescues former zoo animals or performing animals, and see what they think about it and if there's something that you can do about it. And then that would really boil down to either social or political pressure.
Any thoughts specifically on China's decision to once again share pandas with a few U.S. zoos? Do these exchanges help with conservation efforts at all, or is it really just about the public and, diplomatic relations?
It does seem to be mostly about diplomatic relations, but I do think it's a great thing for wildlife, and there are benefits for conservation. Pandas, honestly, are probably the most charismatic species on the planet. People love them. They're just innately cute. They're like these gigantic teddy bears. So they're a huge draw for zoos. When a zoo has panda bears, that will increase the number of people that visit zoos, and that's better for the zoo all around because they can give people more experiences with animals. They can raise more money for their conservation projects and get people more educated about wildlife. They'll come for the panda bears, but they'll see other animals as well.
So how exactly did pandas become such an important symbol on the global stage? Still ahead, I'm joined by an expert on Chinese foreign policy, Yoon Soon. She's a senior fellow at the Stimson Center, which is a nonpartisan think tank focused on foreign affairs. She's the co-director of the organization's East Asia program and the director of its China program. Yoon Soon is explaining the specifics of so-called panda diplomacy and what the new panda deals signify about the current relationship between China and the United States. That's all coming up. But first, a quick break for our sponsors. Lumen is the world's first handheld metabolic coach. It's a device that measures your metabolism through your breath. And on the app, it lets you know if you're burning fat or carbs and gives you tailored guidance to improve your nutrition, workout, sleep, and even stress management. All you have to do is breathe into your lumen first thing in the morning, and you'll know what's going on with your metabolism. You can also breathe into it before and after workouts and meals, so you know exactly what's going on in your body in real time, and Lumen will give you tips to keep you on top of your health game. Having optimal metabolic health translates into a bunch of benefits, including improved energy levels, better fitness results, and more. I find it especially fascinating because before Lumen, assessing your metabolic health required a lengthy, expensive process. But now you can get all that info in Lumen's handheld device. I'm learning so much about my body and how food affects me. Lumen even gives me a personalized nutrition plan for the day based on my measurements. So if you want to take the next step in improving your health, go to lumen.me/newsworthy to get 15% off your Lumen. That's Lumen, LUMEN.me/newsworthy for 15% off your purchase. Thank you, Lumen, for sponsoring this episode. The Newsworthy is also brought to you by Wild Grain. In recent years, I've found some joy preparing fresh meals for my family and myself at home, but I still don't want to spend all day in the kitchen. I just don't have the time. Now, thanks to Wild Grain, I can save time without skimping on deliciousness. Wild Grain is the first ever bake from frozen subscription box for sourdough breads, fresh pastas, and artisanal pastries. The team at Wild Grain just sent me a box, and there's so much goodness inside. Fresh fettuccine, fresh tonarelli, a beautiful sourdough loaf, croissants, slow-fermented brioche rolls, and more. I can take any of that right from my freezer to my oven, and it's ready in 25 minutes or less. I really appreciate that I can get that homemade taste, quality, and even experience without having to start completely from scratch. My family has loved it as well. Your Wild Grain box, though, is fully customizable, so you can choose any combination of breads, pastas, and pastries that you want. Also, Wild Grain just launched a brand new plant-based box featuring a wide selection of plant-based pastries, breads, and hand-cut pastas. Best of all, for a limited time, you can get $30 off the first box, plus free croissants in every box when you go to wildgrain.com/newsworthy to start your subscription. You heard me, free croissants in every box and $30 off your first box when you go to wildgrain.com/newsworthy. That's wildgrain.com/newsworthy, or you can use our promo code newsworthy at checkout. Okay, now to our conversation with the director of the China program at the Stimson Center, Yoon Soon. Yoon Soon, thank you so much for joining us here on the Newsworthy.
Thank you for having me.
So first, can you just describe the term panda diplomacy for us and give us a little bit of history of how China has used pandas as part of its foreign policy over the last few decades?
So panda diplomacy, broadly defined, is the activity of the People's Republic of China using pandas, so either gifting pandas or leasing pandas to foreign countries and foreign governments in exchange for a friendly relationship with the said country. Starting in 1982, this gifting practice evolved towards using Panda for a lease. So this money is paid to the Chinese government on a yearly basis. And this leasing usually has a 10-year term. It should be noted that the Panda diplomacy has only happened between China and countries that China perceives as having a friendly relationship with China. And the connotation is, well, if you're hostile to China, then no panda for you.
And some of these leases can be, millions of dollars over those 10 years, right?
Yeah. So if it's $1 million per year for 10 years, it would be $10 million. And this is on top of the requirements, so physical requirements for the facilities, for the food, for the medical care, and also the basically a whole support team that will have to be established at the zoo receiving the pandas. So it is not cheap. It's a very expensive operation.
And as you mentioned, China only wants to offer pandas to countries it perceives as being friendly. So when China took back 3 pandas that had been living at the Smithsonian National Zoo in Washington, D.C., was that decision a reflection of tensions between the U.S. and China, or was it just simply following the terms of the original agreement?
Technically, you could say the Chinese were following the terms of the original agreement, but we also know those terms are subject to negotiation, subject to adjustment based on the political needs. But by 2023, the relationship was in a pretty rough place. there have been a lot of grievances between the two countries. So when the term of the extension of the lease on the 3 pandas that were hosted at the Smithsonian Zoo expired, the Chinese decided not to extend. And it was, I think most people would see it as a political decision rather than a technical decision.
So what do you think has changed now that China has agreed to do these new deals to share pandas with the San Diego Zoo, the San Francisco Zoo, and the Smithsonian National Zoo in Washington, D.C.? What do you make of that? What has changed?
I think what has changed is that there has been a significant effort, I would say, in both capitals to stabilize the bilateral relations. Maybe not improve it, because improvement is a very high bar, but at least to stabilize the relationship in the hope for the betterment of the bilateral relations. Well, this year is election year here in the United States, and China last year also encountered slow than expected economic growth, especially in terms of foreign trade and foreign direct investment. So you could say that both US and China have an incentive to keep the relationship under check and also keep it stable for the time being.
When we talk about US and China, we're talking about really serious issues. And so why are pandas kind of thrown in there as an issue, or is it more symbolic of what's going on?
The panda diplomacy is seen as a symbol, right? And if the Chinese want to present an optics of the stability or the stabilization of that relationship, sending pandas back to the United States is a very convenient and also very clear signaling. The second aspect of this is, panda diplomacy is probably not going to change the course of the great power competition between US and China, because the strategic conflict between US as a status quo power and China as a revisionist power is not going to be resolved by however many numbers of pandas. But at different times, the pandas still signifies that while the two countries are trying to control the pace and also the tempo of their tension, which is also a key issue for the rest of the world. For the Chinese, the pandas are not just diplomatic tools between the two governments. It's also a diplomatic tool to influence public opinion here in the United States. If the U.S. general public sees panda, they see panda as an olive branch or as an emissary of friendship coming from China. I think the Chinese hope is that, maybe the U.S. general public will develop a slightly more positive view of China as a result of these cute pandas.
And do you think kind of increased collaboration between American and Chinese researchers and conservationists also can play a role?
Well, if there is a role, I'm not saying there is not, it's a pretty small and minimal negligible effect over the broader bilateral relations. Because we're talking about a really big issue here. We're talking about U.S. security alliance in the West Pacific. We're talking about U.S.-China meal-to-meal communication, potential tension around Taiwan. So these are issues that have a direct and immediate impact over the core national interest of both countries. So yes, joint research helps, and joint research on an endangered species like panda is not going to hurt, but to count on the joint research to improve the bilateral relations, I think that's going to be a very long shot.
Well, thank you so much to both of our guests for sharing their expertise. You can read about Yoon Soon's research on the Stimson Center's website and check out Dr. Stephanie Manka's podcast, The Fancy Scientist. We have links to those resources and more on our website at thenewsworthy.com. Then tune in to The Newsworthy again on Monday for our next 10-minute news roundup. Our regular weekday episodes help you start each day in the know with all the latest. So we'll be back on Monday. Until then, have a great weekend.